A preference schedule is just a collection of all of the data after having used preference ballots for an election. So, like looking at a preference schedule, I wanted to just talk about how do you read it and what kind of how do we determine the information from these sorts of things. But basically, what we can see in this table is it says there's a number of voters in this row, which basically says, well, 14, 10, 8, 4, 1. Basically, what it's giving us is a collection of information where these 14 voters all voted in this way. And below we can see, well, who's their first choice, second choice, third choice, and fourth choice. So reading this first column of this sample preference schedule, basically what I can determine is 14 voters voted in this way. 14 people had A as their most desirable candidate, whereas candidate B was their second, third, C, and fourth D. And then I can see, well, 10 people had C as their favorite, A as their least, and so on. Basically, I could go through and look at how each and everyone voted. And in a real data, there would probably be a lot more different permutations of these letters, because if I'm looking at these different arrangements, there's only very specific ones. And a lot of times there could be, way, way more. But a lot of times in the examples we do in the homework and stuff, it's just a sample. It's not necessarily what real data looks like, but it helps us to we're going to use them to help understand the data. And I'm going to be reverting back to this preference schedule through when we do every single method just to sort of compare some results. It's actually the same one the book uses. It just is exactly illustrates a lot of the good points to make um, as well. So anyways, yeah, we call this a preference schedule. Which is just, and again, it's a preference ballot because each voter is given a ranking, right, of a lot of different candidates. They're not given a single choice in the matter. So this is where I'd break for a group activity, and I would ask you, who do you think would win this particular election? Um, so what you could do is pause the video right now and try to answer this question. Basically, just by looking at this data, do you think candidate A should win, candidate B, or candidate C or D? And so let's assume that this ballot, this preference schedule represents an election of a class president. Again, we use that example again, where A stands for Art, B is Ben, C is Kathy, and D is Debbie. Who's going to win? Who's going to be our class president? And before I teach you how to figure it out, that's what I want to. Usually, I'm asking you guys in your groups is, do you think it would be Art? Do you think it would be Ben, Kathy, or Debbie? And another important thing is there's not a correct answer to this. So go ahead and pause and think about this for a minute. You could even post your answer in the discussion board if you want, or post your thinking. But basically, after this, I'll pretend to, I would then also poll you guys and ask you about that from here. But basically, it looks like I don't have the poll built into here, but often I'll like have you guys as a show of hands who think Art should win, who think Ben, Kathy, or Debbie. And usually there's quite a split. Usually about at least a quarter of the class thinks Art should win because of and they I'll ask everybody why did you make this election and why did you think that. And really it's because if we look at who had the most first place votes, that was Art. He had 14 more than any other candidate combined. Which that's actually a legitimate method of determining the outcome of election called plurality. And then a lot of times people will argue, okay, I think Ben should be president because Ben was pretty highly ranked overall and didn't have any last place votes. And people will say the same thing about Kathy. Kathy had a lot of first place votes, second and third. She actually was second in the amount of first place votes too, and wasn't voted last as well. Another good argument. And then, most of the time people will not think Debbie can win based on this data, but basically there's usually not a clear cut answer. And that's another point that is important is technically there is no right answer to this solution, right? So if we're having an election and we're actually getting all this data from our voters, we want to know what the answer is, but there's a lot of different ways of going about it. And that's kind of what we're going to get into in the next few sections is what are the different methods of determining outcome, focusing on how do we make a clear cut decision. And my point is it depends on the method. First of which is called plurality, second is board account, and then for tomorrow's lecture, we'll get into the remaining few methods, plurality with elimination and pairwise comparisons method. And then the last section of chapter 1 will focus on why do we have so many methods, and how can we which method should we use if we wanted to actually have our own election in general. So in the next video, we'll start on plurality and actually get into some examples.